Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our December 23rd edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today's episode features nationally renowned experts in economics and national policy who spoke at Iowa Farm Bureau's annual meeting in Des Moines earlier this month. We'll start with Dr. Jason Henderson, an economist and the vice president of Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. What does Dr. Henderson see when he surveys the current macroeconomy for agriculture? Spokesman reporter Bob Beyond has the story.
Welcome, Jason. Thank you for being with us this morning. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your role at Iowa State University?
Yeah, so I'm the Vice President for Extension and Outreach at Iowa State University. And so my background is I've been in Extension for more than a decade, first at Purdue University. I'm a native of Iowa. I grew up in northeast Iowa on a dairy farm outside of Arlington and went to Central College for my undergrad. And then prior to joining the Extension, I worked at the Federal Reserve Bank out of Kansas City and led their Ag and Rural Analysis group.
Well, today at the Iowa Farm Bureau annual meeting, your presentation focused on the macroeconomy and the implications for agriculture. So yeah, you kind of focused on three areas. The first, maybe we can just touch on that a little bit, was monetary policy and inflation. Kind of depends on productivity and bank lending. Yeah,
it does. Monetary policy today, it was a lot different than when I was first taught economics. It's not just about interest rate moves. It's also about the Federal Reserve printing money through its balance sheet, and then how banks use that money when they do get it. Do they sit it in reserves, or do they put it in lending in the economy, which starts this chasing phenomenon when you think about inflation of too much money chasing too few goods. So I think that's the key that's going to be is like, what do banks do? Do they increase their lending over the next year? And the more lending they do, the more economic activity and more growth they do, the more money they put in reserves, the less lending they do, the less economic activity and lower inflation. So those are a lot of things that are going on. But another key point in there, the second one, is really about technology. Okay. And how does that boost labor productivity, and how do we utilize it to increase the productivity of our workforce?
You also touched on farm income and the prospects for farm income going forward. Farmers are optimistic, you said, but it all kind of depends on demand and where demand will emerge.
Yeah, it does. Farmers are great at producing, and whenever there's an extra opportunity for profits, they're going to produce and expand their operations and produce more. And we continue to grow more each and every year, whether it's livestock or on the crop side. So the question is can we push demand? And how do we grow demand? And in agriculture, it tends to come in fit and starts. You know, we get booms with ethanol or booms with trade and those aspects of it. So what's the next surge of demand that will help push agriculture forward? And where's it going to come from? In the past, it was China. Is it India? Is it overseas in other parts of the globe? Right. Is it turning back to the U.S. consumer and thinking about value-added activity? But where's that next demand part going to come from? Is it biofuels? That's, I think, the key in terms of the outlook for agriculture.
Well, then you turn to farm finances. You said ag is well positioned, but farm debt is concentrated.
Yeah, agriculture and farmer, I mean, my definition of a farmer is a person that's asset rich and cash poor. I mean, we use a lot of debt in terms of financing agriculture, and so this is the big key going forward. During the boom, farmers did a really good job of managing their balance sheet, and they didn't load up on debt. They didn't really leverage the farm. They built up working capital, and they're using that now to make it through, to get them through the downturn. That said, in general, it's true, but there are going to be some pockets that we're going to have to be cognizant of and think about going forward. Young and beginning farmers that just got into the business, they were the ones growing their operation. And so they were looking at expanding their machinery, buying a farm, getting into the business. They're the ones that have the higher levels of debt that are out there. And so we have to think about them because that's the future of farming in terms of that young and beginning farmer that's out there. The other aspect of it is that we have other concentrations in the larger operations, those with $1 million or more in sales. They've been the operations that have been growing the last couple of years, and that's where you get some increases in debt and this consolidation or concentration of debt in those enterprises as well.
Maybe a couple thoughts on things farmers are interested in. You touched on a few of these, so I'll kind of run down a few of them. First one would be tariffs. effect on the U.S. economy if these are implemented?
Yeah, so tariffs, anytime, from economic theory in our past history will say is when you implement a tariff, what it does is it boosts costs and boosts prices. And so it's going to be not in the country where the goods are coming from, but in the U.S. So the question is okay, you're going to get, if you get tariffs in there, what's the retaliation from other countries? In that 2016, 2018 timeframe, when we had increased tariffs on China, they retaliated on agricultural commodities.
Yep.
And so what's it going to be this time around? China has already focused their efforts on their communication on rare earth metals, right? So if there's tariffs, what's the retaliation going to be? Is it agriculture or is it something else? And what are the ripple effects of that going through? But ultimately, it'll be higher prices.
Farm investment. You mentioned that farmers are not spending. So where are we headed?
Farmers right now in this downturn, they're managing their debt. And so they're not going to be making big investments. And they have facing higher interest rates. So they're not buying steel and machinery. And they're a little bit cautious on farmland at this point in time. What we're hearing is that the demand for farmland has been coming from non-farm demand sources kind of coming into the market. But farmers are also looking at good buy opportunities.
Right.
And that's where they're at right now. And so, if there's a piece of land that comes next to theirs that is really close and is a good buy, they're going to take advantage of it or try to if they can. But they're looking for those good buy opportunities, that this is a good purchase, it works in my thing, I can manage my debt levels and make it work with our operation.
So maybe they'll look at farmland values as a good investment, but as far as other spending, tractors, combines, things like that, maybe not going to see that as much.
Yeah, they're not going to see that as much in terms of the machinery. We've already seen declines on machinery purchases by farmers, and we're seeing the ripple effects on some of the ag equipment manufacturers here in Iowa. Right. And farmers also, when it comes to land, they take a long-term perspective, not what's going to happen over the next year or two, but they look out 5 to 10 years. What does that look like from their investment portfolio? So if they're going to make an investment, it's going to be land first, and then other types of equipment.
Talk about the 1980s. Will we see what we saw back then? That's a lot of discussion among the farm community.
Yeah, it seems like every farm downturn, everybody goes back to the 1980s of what's going to happen. My short answer is no. Okay. Our farm debt to asset ratios and equity ratios are very low historically, and well below what it was in the 1980s time period. Right. And in fact, you would have to have sizable gains in farm debt and huge declines in farmland values to get to a 1980s scenario. Okay. It's probably not the most likely outcome in a crystal ball scenario, but we just have to manage our debt wisely in agriculture. It's something that was one of the lessons from the 80s. Right. Don't leverage the farm.
Right. And lastly, how about biofuels? Called it a wild card.
It is. I think biofuels is a wild card because we have to look at other sources of demand, and that's the one. You have ethanol here in Iowa, a big source of demand. People talk about biodiesel, renewable diesel. We've seen some recent gains. What does the outlook look like? I think a lot of that's going to depend on tax credits and the source of demand on that. The other part of it is what are the other sources of demand? So there's a lot of things in there so biofuels, bioplastics, other types of products that we can make out of agriculture. But when it comes down to biofuels, it's a wild card because for me it's policy driven. And so what does the policy look like for biofuels? What does the tax credit base look like to see it going forward? And I think that's what makes it the wild card.
Well, let's kind of finish with maybe an overall assessment. We talked a little bit about that, but an overall assessment of the ag economy now and maybe where we're going to be in 5-10 years.
Yeah, this is the typical ag cycle. Okay. We have farm booms, and then we followed by farm downturns where you hunker down a little bit, you shore up your debt base, you shore up your balance sheet. And I think in agriculture, they need to think about how do we reposition and get ready to grow. And what does that growth look like? Now, it might be 2 to 3 years out, but this over the next year, 18 months is a time frame to think about, okay, even in a downturn, let's think about how do we position our farm enterprise for growth. My dad always said, you buy low and sell high to make money. So is this a time frame that we have to think about how do we position agriculture where you can buy low and position yourself for future growth?
Lots to consider as we turn the page to 2025. Not only do farmers need to consider their own financial realities and market forces that are far beyond their control, they also need to have their eyes on the national policy arena, biofuels, trade, a new farm bill, and more. For more on national policy, let's bring on Zippy Duvall, who's the president of the American Farm Bureau. Spokesman editor Tom Block caught up with President Duvall at Iowa Farm Bureau's annual meeting and county leadership conference earlier this month.
President Duvall, in your role, you have the opportunity to spend a lot of time talking with farmers from all across the United States. What's your sense of how farmers are feeling right now about the ag economy?
Well, they're stressed out right now, and it's because of the economy, but they're also stressed out because of all the natural disasters they've experienced all over the country. It's ranged from fires to straight-line winds to hurricanes to tornadoes and drought and too much rain. So it's just been all over the board depending on where you was at. But the economy was piled on top of that, and low prices has been very difficult for our farmers. And we're in a very bad slump right now, and in a time when Congress and politics doesn't seem to be in the mood to help.
Yeah, with those economic struggles, that's exposed some gaps in the farm safety net that aren't necessarily covered by crop insurance or current farm bill programs. What can Congress do to help those farmers who are struggling with negative margins due to low prices, as well as those disasters that you talked about, both short-term and long-term help that Congress can provide?
Yeah, well, since they've kicked the can down the road and haven't chosen to give us a modernized farm bill, they're going to have to step up and make sure that we have a disaster payment and an economic payment to help our farmers bridge the gap between the old farm bill, the one they're talking about extending, and the new one that's coming along that hopefully will be improved to be able to give us the risk management tools that actually work in this day and time.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that. We've been operating on a short-term extension of the Farm Bill for over a year now, since the Farm Bill expired in 2023. Why is that long-term Farm Bill needed and the certainty it gives to farmers? And where do you think that stands as a priority for Congress right now?
Well, I think there is a priority to get it done, but I don't think the votes are there to get it done right now. And as we move toward the end of the year and maybe an end-of-year package that would include an extension and a disaster and possibly an economic payment, there's a lot of politics going on as whether or not they are willing to do any deficit spending or not. And of course the politics of reappointing the new Speaker of the House and all the things that go along with that. We really need for our President-elect to step in and say, you know, I've committed to keep our farmers healthy, and we've got to do something to help them.
And in addition to the Farm Bill, there's a whole list of other ag issues that need attention in Washington, right? Three that I'd like to have you maybe touch on a little bit about each of them. Interstate commerce, especially in light of how California's Prop 12 law has affected our hog farmers here in Iowa. The package of tax cuts passed in 2017, which will be due to expire next year. And then trade is always an issue here, and agriculture now facing its largest trade deficit on record. Can you describe a little bit more about each of those issues and what Farm Bureau is doing to make sure that each of those policies are addressed by Congress as well?
Absolutely. The interstate commerce and the Prop 12 issue is one that affects hog producers, but we all know that what's in their backyard today will be in everybody else's backyard soon come, and we got to fix this because a patchwork of laws like that around the country, state laws like that around the country, would devastate our opportunity to produce and send it across state lines. So we got to find a fix for that. We were very, very supportive and worked real hard to make sure that it was in the Farm Bill that came out of the House Ag Committee with a bipartisan vote. And everywhere we're talking today, even as we talk about extension and in a disaster and economic payment, we're also talking about a Prop 12 fix. So that is something that is on the list that gets talked about on Capitol Hill every day. It's important. Now, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017 was very important to agriculture and small businesses across America. And we're going to be working hard to make a lot of those pieces permanent in the next administration. And I think with this administration, we got a good opportunity to do some of that. So we're always trying to get rid of estate tax and do away with it. But at the levels that we have exemptions today, it only affects about 4% of our farms across America. But we would love to just do away with it because it has a very unfair tax and makes it difficult for us to pass our farms on. But we're going to be calling to our membership to help us in getting these tax cuts reaffirmed and try to make some of them permanent. And they're going to play a major role by being engaged in telling their story as to how these tax cuts have helped their farms and how it would help in the future be able to be sustainable. And the third one, trade, has been non-existent during this last administration. We're very disappointed. And now we got a new administration coming in that did a good job in his first administration with trade deals with USMCA and the phase one with China. We did have to suffer through a trade war with tariffs, and he's talking about tariffs again. We all know that American agriculture catches the blunt of that, so we don't support tariffs. So our plan is to be with the president, make sure he knows when he does something how it's going to affect American agriculture, so that he can fulfill his commitment to always stand behind his American farmers, and we're going to continue to work on that. Obviously, there's some problems between Canada and Mexico and America right now with USMCA, and hopefully we can find some solutions in those problems before things get worse than what they are.
Talking about the Trump administration coming into office, you had a very good relationship with the Trump administration during his first term, some of that with the Secretary of Agriculture at the time coming from your home state of Georgia. What's your sense of agriculture's place and importance as President Trump returns to office here for his second term?
Well, I'm looking forward to having a conversation with him, and I think that'll happen real soon. There's nothing happened between farmers and ranchers in rural America and President Trump to have changed his opinion about supporting rural America and farmers and ranchers. So I think he'll come into this administration, hopefully, and allow us to maintain the same seat we had with him and be able to share information with him to help him make the wise decisions that are good for rural America and farmers and ranchers, and look forward to having that opportunity with him.
Let's turn to Farm Bureau issues a little bit. We're very glad that you've come to Iowa to talk to our members here at the Iowa Farm Bureau annual meeting. In addition to a speech to the conference as a whole, you also met with our county presidents. What was your message to those county presidents and those leaders who really drive this organization?
Well, I've declared this year the year of the county president. And I did that because if you look across this organization to try to identify the most important position in our organization, it really comes down to that foundational position we know as county president. Now, he doesn't do it by himself. He has a great board and supportive people there in his county, but he's the one that actually leads the charge. And he's the one that can engage our membership. He's the one that can take on challenges and make opportunities out of them. He's the one that can build our membership. He is the foundational position in our organization, and I'm trying to elevate that position, thank him for what they're doing, thank them for the ones that are thinking about doing it in the future, and tell them that, we're here to help them do their job, because without them we do not exist, and we don't accomplish anything without that engaged membership that they can activate.
Talk about those members who may be just getting into the organization for their first time. What's one piece of advice you have for those farmers who might be listening but haven't taken the step into those leadership roles? Why should they get involved with Farm Bureau?
Well, our organization provides a vehicle for farmers to tell them story and have their voice heard, whether it be through policy or directly with a congressman or senator or even a president of the United States. And we can provide that vehicle to any farmer across America. But they got to be willing to allot a little bit of their time and get outside their fence rows and be part of this great organization. And if you don't do that, you're like a lone wolf on top of the hill howling. Nobody really hears you. Or they may hear you, but they don't really care what you sound like. But you get inside a Farm Bureau where you got others that you can join hands with and develop policy and speak with one united voice, and it comes across very, very strong and very effective in getting things done policy-wise to help agriculture and our rural communities move forward.
And I've heard this story before, but just tell a little bit about how your personal involvement got started with Farm Bureau. I've heard that phrase, get outside your fence row, and I have to admit I've borrowed it a time or two when I've written for our publication.
Well, I got to give that to my dad. And like most of us farmers, we followed in the footsteps of our dad. And my dad was a farmer, and he was a dedicated Farm Bureau member. And after he had his heart attack and I came back home to take over the dairy, and I'd be sitting at his breakfast table and I'd be complaining about all the things about federal milk inspection and not finding anybody to work and labor and all the things that we had to deal with. And he just looked at me one day and he said, well, son, if you want to do something about that, you're going to have to get outside your fence rows and be part of something bigger than you are. And he took me to a Farm Bureau meeting. I became the young farmer chairman in my county. And then, of course, with unbelievable support from local people in Farm Bureau encouraging me to step up, go do this, be on this committee, serve on the Young Farmer Committee, go to Washington and represent us, and just pushing you and supporting you and convincing me that I really had the ability to do that. And without that encouragement from good foundational leaders in my county, I probably wouldn't be sitting here today. You know, I look back and I'll never be able to repay this organization for what it's done for my farm and the opportunity it's given me to actually tell my story and be able to make a difference in policy. People out there that haven't been involved, they really don't understand how effective we can be when farmers take a little time from their schedule and tell their story, because it is vitally important and is vitally powerful.
Yeah, farming is foundational to this country. President Trump has, I think, acknowledged that. But for all the challenges, too, there's something special, too, about the rural spirit, right?
Yeah, everybody wants to be a farmer, you know. But nobody wants to do it all day, every day, all day long, you know. And, you know, even my grandchildren, that's what they want to do, you know. But they still can't comprehend the day in and day out and the gruel that goes with it. But when we open up our farms and tell our story to people that just wish they could farm, and they have some little bit of understanding of who we are, why we do what we do, and when they get that understanding, it's a proven fact that they approve of us, they trust us more, and they're willing to step out on a limb to help us too when it comes to advocating. So we need all the farmers, we need all our neighbors and friends to be able to tell the story of rural America and farmers and ranchers and what we do for this country, because what we do is provide national security through a food system that is the envy of the world. Because when you go to other parts of the world where they can't feed themselves, it's not a very kind, nice place.
Well, President Duvall, I appreciate your time, and thanks for coming here to join us in Iowa.
Yeah, thank you. I've always enjoyed coming to Iowa. It is an absolutely beautiful state, and this is a wonderful State Farm Bureau here that's here to help farmers and ranchers and their county leaders move forward in the future.
Thanks, President Duvall. That's a good recap of the national policy issues farmers will face in 2025. And it's a great explanation of why becoming involved in Farm Bureau matters as we work to overcome the challenges facing agriculture. As President Duvall said, it all starts at the county level. So if you haven't taken that first step into Farm Bureau, we hope you'll consider doing that in the new year. If you need help getting started, we've included a link with contact information for each of Iowa's 100 county farm bureaus down in the notes for this podcast episode. That's all for this edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We'd like to wish you and yours a Merry Christmas, and we hope you'll join us for our next episode on January 6th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to The Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.